Good afternoon. All right, so my name is Gideon, and I work for PingIdentity as a software quality engineer. And in case you haven't heard of PingIdentity, I was going to change that, and then I decided I'll just lean into it, make a meta joke, it'll be fine. So PingIdentity, we are an identity security company, and what that means is, you know that old saying, don't roll your own authentication? Let us roll your authentication. And specifically, the product I work on is our new cloud-based program called PingOne for Customers, which is an IDaaS solution, which stands for Identity as a Service, because if there's anything that software needs, I think it's more acronyms. So PingOne for Customers uses RESTful API calls to allow your application to do authorization and authentication. And in case you're not familiar with REST and RESTful, that's just a fancy way of saying API calls made over HTTP, which is something that Postman does very well. So that's kind of how I got into Postman. But first, in case there's anyone here or in the future watching on YouTube who's not familiar with OAuth and OIDC, I'm going to do a quick review here. So OAuth 2.0 specifically, because if it's an identity protocol, it should have failed the first time. All right. It is an open standard for access delegation, and it's more of a framework. It doesn't really specify exactly what you need to do. So the upside of that is there's lots of choices and different implementations of OAuth. You know, they can do it their own way, and you can just figure out what makes them special. Grant types is one of those options, depending on what grant types your OAuth provider provides. But we're going to focus mostly on the auth code grant type. I'll get to that in a second. So other protocols, including OpenID Connect, aka OIDC, are built on top of OAuth. But at the end of the day, what OAuth does is it gets you or your application a token. And so then you can go use like a streaming API, for example, using that token. So, all right, so I mentioned the grant types. We're going to mostly focus on the auth code flow, also known as three-legged OAuth. And if you're not sure what that means, really easy. Just Google it, see a diagram like that, which I think completely explains it. And you may have some questions. You're like, I don't know, that's fine. Find another image that explains it more. Maybe you want like a handwritten version of it. Actually, I like this one. This one's pretty good. That one's like sideways. So I'm not going to do that. And I apologize. I did have to zoom in to avoid the logo of that company there. But I do want to take a quick poll of the audience. Now, who here has ever used Valet? Okay, so a few people. And how many people have a Valet key for their car? Or knows what that is? Really? That's more than I was expecting. But hopefully we'll get to the next bit here. Who here has ever been someplace where you had to get a wristband to drink something? All right, and if you can't see, that's more people. So funny thing about OAuth, I mean, if the camera's pointed at me, that people aren't going to see the audience. Whenever you look up OAuth, they always use this metaphor of a valet key, which I'm like, I mean, yeah, I guess, but why not use wristbands? It seems like people have a lot more experience with this, so that's what we're going to use. So auth code, you're going to start off, and you're trying to access a beer tent. And so first, you have to go over to the ID tent. They're like, I'm sorry, we're not sure if you can drink. I don't get carded anymore because I have a nice beard, but maybe not everyone has a beard. And so you go over to, let's say, the PingOne identity tent, and they're going to ask you for some kind of identification. Now, OAuth doesn't specify exactly how this happens, so this is the part where you send a user over to the identity provider, and they figure out who they are, and they eventually send them back to your application, hopefully with this, which is your wristband, so you can go get a drink, except if you've been paying attention or if you know OAuth, what you realize is I just described the implicit flow. And for the auth code, the metaphor falls apart. What you get is a code, specifically an auth code, that you send to your, I'm just going to call it a web app backend now, and then that goes over to the token endpoint of your identity provider, and then you exchange that code for a token, which you can go then use on the resource server. So, like I said, this is not only about OAuth, it's also about testing this. And as a little bit of background, when I first started working at Ping almost 2 years ago, the interview actually was the very first time I used Postman. And 2 years later, I'm kind of like the go-to Postman guy at the office. And the way I got really good at it was we had all these microservices. And you see there's like a bunch of them. I have a collection for every service there. And if you can't see all the text, that's fine. This is just sort of to demonstrate that over time we built up these collections so that I, as a quality engineer, didn't have to worry about the low-level details of, say, getting a token and then copying and pasting it into the auth header. Instead, I have tests here that use JavaScript, grab the token, save it. You can see on the console there on the left side of the screen that it says auth token is set. And now here I'm making a create user request. And there are like a lot of variables. Those are all dynamic variables, if you've heard about that at some of the other talks. And I forget what they do. So what I did there is I expanded the description, and I have this handy table that I'm very proud of that explains all of the limits of all the user fields and what you can and can't put in them. And then you just stick Markdown in the description, and you can have nice tables too. And they look really good. So now I think finally I make the request, hopefully, and the recording. And I really love folding because there's a lot of JSON there. But you see that I created a user, and I want to get that ID. Again, I had some scripts that went and grabbed the ID, saved it as a variable in Postman, so that now when I want to get a user, I can just get that same user because the user ID is already there as a variable. So I got the user, and now say I want to delete that user, got a successful request, and now the user doesn't exist anymore. All right. So that's kind of the setup. We're going to do the same thing in a moment here with the OAuth process, and this is just kind of a preview of what's going to happen. We're going to make an authorize request. This is the beginning thing that you do, and then usually what you get back is a 300 series response that then sends the user on their browser over to go do the login part. Not covered by the specification, so that'll vary from IDP to IDP. Eventually, though, they come back to your application with a code, usually at a different endpoint. And then you're going to exchange that code for the access token, which then allows you to go use the APIs. So, like I said, I apologize. The text is a little small. What I'm doing here is making the authorize request. I'm putting in just a random scope. That's an important part of the authorize request. And then I'm also asking for a specific type of authorization. That was the passwordless type of authorization, which means that instead of using a username and password, I'm going to eventually just use the username and then use a MFA. Kind of important there, I did mention 300 series codes, and by default, Postman will follow redirects. But if you have a 300, maybe you don't want to follow that because I'm not a browser, I'm Postman. So what you're seeing there is that it didn't follow the 300. It just looked up the location header so that I can grab this value. Again, all done programmatically. There's kind of like a lot of JavaScript in there. But what it did is it found this ID of the authentication that I'm doing so that I can make a request against that authentication. It's saying that I need my username. So I entered my username, sent the request, and now it's telling me that I need a one-time password, and then it slows down a little bit because I had to pull out my phone and get my email and type in the one-time password. But at the end, once you make that request, that finishes the authentication. Now again, this is not OAuth specified. This is just our particular system, and it's very customizable. But the idea is that I want to manually make all of the requests. Normally, your browser would just follow the location header and go somewhere, and then you'd use our sign-on UI, but you can customize that. So what I care about is just, hey, I got my auth code. Now I'm going to take my auth code, and I'm going to pretend like I'm the web app or the backend server, and then turn that into an access token. And kind of briefly here, the reason that you exchange the code for the token is that the user brings the code in the URL bar of the browser. And so if you bring an access token right there, well, they can see it and they can go use it maliciously. But if you bring a code, you can send it to the backend, and then the backend can use server-side validation and then use the access token responsibly. All right, so the next bit here is OpenID Connect, which again is an authentication layer on top of OAuth. And what that means is that if you use just OAuth to figure out who someone is, that's equivalent to saying, hey, go get me the mail for John Smith, and then someone brings you back the mail for John Smith, proving that they're John Smith, except maybe someone else has the keys to all the mailboxes. So the way that OpenID Connect adds authentication on top of this is by providing two tokens. You get an access token, which lets you use whatever API you're interested in, and then you also get an ID token, which has some information about the user. It also has the user info endpoint, which is very similar to the ID token in that it's another way to get information about the user. There's just some subtle differences, but here is the last demo where we see that I have my access token from last time, and I'm going to make a new authorize request, and I'm going to change the scope. Now, in this case, what's going to happen is I have an existing session, so it just immediately gives me back a new auth code, which I can exchange for a new token. So that's what I'm going to do here. Now I have a new token, and I have an ID token. If you're curious, these are JOTs, so you can pull them out and unbase64 decode them and see all the claims. But there, I use my token, and I hit the user info endpoint, which shows the subclaim, which is just, hey, here's an ID for the user, so you know who they are. And there, I believe I'm adding an extra scope so that when I get a new token and then hit the user info endpoint, I get more information about that user, including dynamic information. And then here I'm signing out, which is just you send in the ID token and you say, hey, kill the session. The other way to kill the session, especially if you're in Postman, is to just kill all of the cookies. That way you're starting fresh. OK, and I went through that a little bit fast, but hopefully we're making up time and staying on schedule. So what we learned is don't roll your own authentication. Remember, we can do that. Pay someone else to do that. OAuth and OIDC handle authorization and authentication in that order, and you generally want both. Good Postman collections enable QA, devs, documentation, and then end users. So if you have those collections that do nice things like grab IDs and then save them as a variable so that you don't have to copy and paste, it makes it easier to think about multiple steps in a row, hitting multiple endpoints, and doing something larger than having to individually think a lot about the mechanics of making a request. And then finally, that testing APIs that use HTTP is all about those requests and responses. So again, pretend like you're the application, make a request, get a response, and then usually you make some new request, and that's all there is to it. But again, I'm not doing questions right now. I'm going to be after the next presentator. So thank you.